Well, good evening, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from. Over the next hour, we're going to take you from lockdown London to occupied France in the company of the man who brought murder to the Western Isles. On behalf of Aberdeen Performing Arts and all our festival partners, welcome to Granite Noir 2021. I'm Brian Burnett, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this digital staging of Aberdeen's International Crime Writing Festival. Now, if you're a BSL user or someone in your house is, this performance is being signed, so just follow the link on the website. And talking of that website, there's a chat box there. Please don't be shy. We would love to get your questions throughout the session and hear from as many of you as we can, and we will leave plenty of time at the end to get through your questions. Now, today's guest, Peter May, has sold over 4.5 million novels, and his work has been translated into something like 32 different languages. But last year, he found himself back in the bestseller charts and became the author of the most talked about crime novel of the year. Lockdown was set in London during a global pandemic. The NHS was overwhelmed. We were all told to stay at home, and no one was safe from this deadly virus. Is it any wonder that when he wrote it 5 years ago, publishers said this was ludicrous? No one would ever believe such a thing would happen. He returns with a new book, The Nightgate, which is published next month. And we also see the return of one of his best-loved characters, the retired forensic scientist Enzo MacLeod, who's persuaded to help solve the vicious murder of a famous art critic. That is linked to a murder that happened 70 years before. And at the center of it, the most famous work of art of all time, which may hold clues as to why these men were killed. To join us to talk about that and so much more, welcome Peter May. Brilliant to have you here.
Lovely to be here, Brian.
Where exactly are you joining us from today?
I'm in southwest France, about 2 hours north of Toulouse, lying in the middle of nowhere. So, but I'm not speaking French tonight, so nobody has to get out their translation, their dictionary and their phrase books and stuff.
We may well have some people tuning in from France. I think over the weekend, we've had people from around 50 different countries, which is amazing. Let's get into talking about the new novel. You described it as a child of coronavirus. What did you mean by that?
Well, because it wasn't the book that I intended to write. I had spent some months at the end of 2019 and into 2020 developing a storyline and doing all the research for a book which was going to be set on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. And I had my research trip all booked up. That was for May last year. And then, of course, along came the coronavirus. And by March, it became clear that I was going to have to cancel that research trip. It was just simply wasn't possible to go. And I never write about a place that I haven't been to. So I was left in a major quandary. What do I do? I had a deadline to make with my publisher's contract, and of course readers were expecting a new book at the early part of 2021. So I had to come up with something new, and The Nightgate was the book that I came up with.
Are you one of these people who always has to be working?
I guess I probably am. I like to unwind. I like to relax. The danger with that is, of course, that relaxation can become addictive, and you get as addicted to doing nothing as you do to working all the time. But by and large, yes, I hate to be idle. I like to be doing something, to have a project on the go.
You're surrounded by toys at the moment in this wonderfully equipped music studio. Is that not too much of a distraction when you're trying to write a new book?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't in here. I don't think I was in here once during the writing of the book. as I was in my study in the house, which is just across the way behind me. This is an apartment above a double garage, which I converted into a music studio to indulge my love of music, which has been with me all my life. It actually turned into a great facility for being able to do promotion around the world during lockdown, because we couldn't travel. So it's been great.
In this new book, Enzo MacLeod, one of your best loved characters, returns. He's retired now. When you first wrote him, you were a struggling author. You were trying hard to get published. Do you write him differently now that you're successful?
I don't think so. I think Enzo's the same person that he was when I started writing him. He and I were both around about the same age when I started writing him, and we were both about 50 at that point, and we both had ponytails and were called old hippies by our daughters. He was a great lover of food and drink, which of course is a reflection of my own preferences in life. And he's not really changed over the years, and neither have I. So writing for him is just, it's always like just getting together with an old friend again. You may not have been with them for a while, but it seems like no time has passed at all.
Is he you then? Because when I read this new book, and it's about someone who's been doing this for a long time, maybe an age when you could possibly retire, but there's still that desire to do the thing he loves, and people still want him to do it. And I kind of thought, is this Peter talking about himself here?
Well, yes, there's an element of truth in that. He's not entirely me. He owes a lot of his character and personality to me, but I think he's much crankier than I am. And he's a bit more flirtatious, shall we say, than I am. He has a great love of the opposite sex, which I do too. But it's no. I mean, people over the years have said he's you, isn't he? He's you. He's probably, of all the characters I've ever written, he's the closest to me.
You obviously hold him pretty close to your heart. Do you feel affection towards him?
Oh yes. I mean, he's a bit of an idiot. A kind of lovable idiot. He always manages to get into ridiculous situations and respond in entirely the wrong way, which is a bit like myself. But in fact, there was a critic in America once described him as a cross between Inspector Clouseau and James Bond, which made me laugh a lot. I like him a lot, and he's easy to write for. And in a way, I suppose it was the easy option for me when it came to writing this book, because I could have created a new character for the Nightgate, for the contemporary element of the story. But because it was set in France, and it was going to be set in this part of France where I live, and Enzo lives not far from here in the town of Cahors, it just seemed like he was the obvious person to do it. And it saved me creating a new character, which, given that I was under considerable amount of time pressure to write the book, was a bit of a godsend, really.
Tell us a bit about the storyline. I was going to say a brief bit about the storyline, but that's very hard to do because this is an epic tale.
It is. I mean, I think you summed it up quite well. There's a contemporary murder of a famous French art critic in a rural French village. In fact, a village just across the valley there. And it's linked to a murder which took place 70 years earlier, which is uncovered, shall we say, by a tree which is blown over in a storm, and the roots disinter this body that's been laying in the earth since the 1940s. And as the investigation into those two apparently separate things get underway, then a link is discovered between them, and that link involves the Mona Lisa. It was a story which grew out of a blog post that I had done about a year previously. I subscribed to a photo blog called Blip Photo, and I'd posted a photograph that I'd taken at a local exhibition in a town hall in a village just along the road. And that exhibition was about the evacuation of the art, the entire collection of art from the Louvre during the war to keep it out of German hands and safe from bombing. The art had moved to various chateaux around France, but for the last 2 years of the war, it ended up right here in this area where I live. Most of it in a chateau along the road called Chateau de Montal. So I was looking at this. The Mona Lisa was there as well, and they had staged a mock-up of the Mona Lisa in the kind of crate that it was transported in, and that's the photographs that I took for the blog. The thing was that as I was looking at all the other photographic exhibits around the exhibition, I suddenly found myself looking at this photograph, an old black and white photograph of a building that I owned. And it was a double garage with an apartment above it. And it's where I'm sitting right now. And this was used as an overspill for some of the art that they couldn't get into the Chateau de Montal. And where I'm sitting right now, along the length of this room and right along the corridor to the back of the apartment, huge canvases from the Louvre, which had been taken out of their frames and rolled around long poles for transportation, were laid out here. These are world famous paintings like The Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese and the Sacre de Napoleon by David. I mean, they were right here. I still feel the spirit of them. I can feel them sitting here now. I've searched about the place and they didn't leave anything here, I'm afraid. But I wrote about this. I just thought it was an extraordinary coincidence. And I got an extraordinary response from readers saying, well, that would make a great book. What a fantastic story. And, at the time, I couldn't really see what the story was. I thought it was an interesting piece, but for a narrative, for a novel, I didn't see it. But when I was scratching around last May, June for an idea, I returned to that and thought, well, it obviously appealed to people. Let's see if I can fashion a story from this. And bit by bit, the story started putting itself together. And it involved storylines that take place in two different times, one contemporary, the other in 1940s France during the war, which involved a huge amount of research, but very interesting and enjoyable research, and research I could do from home because I was confined to quarters because of the lockdown in France. And as far as the contemporary element of the story was concerned, most of the action took place in places I know well anyway. So I didn't have to, travel to see them. Although I did last summer when restrictions were considerably lighter, I did refresh my memory. I went to revisit Chateau Montal and the Tour Saint Laurent and the village across the valley there where a lot of the action is set, Carinac, which is one of the most, described as one of the most beautiful villages in France.
There is something sweet about that story of a man who's spent a chunk of his life traveling around the world researching his books. And the research for this one has led him back literally to his own front door.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there is a sweet irony about it. And it all came to pass just at the right time to provide me with a story to write when I was kind of incapacitated by the pandemic.
The Mona Lisa, as I said at the start, is at the center of this. You write, still she stared at him as if she knew why he was here. And slowly he felt himself falling under her spell. even after all these centuries, she still had the power to seduce. What is the appeal of her to writers over the years?
I don't know. There's quite a mystique, isn't there? When I first went to see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, she was hung in this really quite gloomy little corner of the art galleries, and I was initially quite disappointed. There were huge crowds, and you couldn't really get near the painting. And the first thing that strikes you about it is it's so tiny. It's only about this size. I mean, it's very, very small. And when you do get close to it, you'll see it's quite deformed by the craquelure. It's called the varnish and paint that's cracked over all the years. But through that haze, that mist of time, there's this strange smile that emerges from the gloom. And it is quite a gloomy picture when you actually see it. I can't put my finger on it. There is something, it's not just me. It's obviously it has had that effect on people over generations and generations. It's just an extraordinary work.
Among the people who coveted the Mona Lisa, very early into the novel, Hitler appears, and he's desperate to own this work of art. How do you drop Hitler into a book, particularly when almost everyone's got their own idea of what he was like? Did that make you nervous?
I wasn't nervous about it. It was a challenge, and I really enjoyed it. The thing about Hitler was, in terms of the art, he wasn't after these paintings for himself. He wanted to create this super museum in Linz in Austria, which was his hometown. And he wanted the best art in the world to be there. He wanted it as a kind of glorification of the whole Nazi ideal. It was interesting going back, reading about his personal history as a failed painter himself, and trying to get a sense of the personality, because we all know the monster, and we all know in a sense the cliche that is Hitler, but it was who is the person behind that, who has this kind of dream of creating a super museum? Why would he want to do that? And so that's why the primary scene that I did with him was at the Berghof, which was his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, and I was able to get a sense of the atmosphere and the kind of general sense of personableness that there was there. I mean, a kind of bonhomie that existed there, mostly from Eva Braun's home movies. I mean, she took a lot of home movies, and they're all in color, which kind of takes it away from that black and white time distance thing. So it was interesting to just get to feel all that and think about all that. I mean, the other character, of course, was Goering, he's after the painting for himself. He wants it. He's a very different character from Hitler, and in a way more interesting to write. I mean, he was hugely eccentric. I mean, he had this huge hunting lodge in the estate called Curran Hall, north of Berlin, where he had a cinema and a swimming pool and a dental surgery. I mean, this is all at the kind of German taxpayers' expense, of course. And he kept lion cubs. I mean, just so you couldn't make characters like this up. They can only come out of history for real. And it was a challenge to write for these characters, but a joy to do it as well.
The thing that runs through almost all your work, it's two things. They are very cleverly plotted and they are impeccably researched. How difficult is it to leave the research behind and start creating the fiction?
It's a process whereby one feeds into the other, really. When I start developing an idea, usually there's an element of it that is going to require considerable amount of research, because I like to make life difficult for myself. And but I enjoy research. I mean, I guess that's the thing. I do enjoy it. And as I learned as a journalist how to research anything at a drop of a hat. Never be afraid to pick up a phone and ask somebody if they can help you. And so that's always a major part of the process for me, the research. And a lot of creative ideas come out of the research, things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of if I hadn't done the research. But at the end of the day, the research is the slave to the story. The story is the most important thing. And the story itself, it won't work unless you have fully fleshed and developed characters. So there's a kind of relationship between character, story, and research, which is vital to the creation of the whole. But as you say, there may be a concern that you put far too much of your research into the story just because you've done it. But I don't think, I hope I don't do that. But I do like to create a sense for my readers that I have done my research and that what I'm writing about is founded in fact.
Are you still a journalist at heart then?
I don't think I really ever was a journalist at heart. I was a kind of accidental journalist.
You were an award-winning journalist, weren't you?
Well, yes, I was, yes. But it's a strange thing, because, when I was a teenager, still at school, I wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was the ambition. And I had, you in fifth year or sixth year, you got appointments with careers advisory officer in the school to discuss your future, what it was you were going to do. And I had an appointment. It was a lady, and she said, "So what is it you want to do? What do you want to be?" I said, "I want to be a writer," and she laughed. I mean, to her it was that absurd. I mean, a writer. Well, and of course, in those days there was no career route to becoming a writer. There were no creative writing courses at university. It was. I mean, I had no idea how I could become a writer except by just writing. And so I didn't want to go to university, and I'd got expelled from school anyway. And I took on kind of crazy jobs, working at interest and bank books at the Department of National Savings and selling secondhand cars, writing all the time, but always wondering where on earth I was going, what my direction was. And then I discovered by chance an application for a place on a journalist course being run by the NCTJ, which is the National Council for the Training Journalists, at a college in Edinburgh. And I applied. I thought, here's a way of making a living by writing. It wasn't the kind of writing that I had envisaged, but it was still writing. And so I applied for that, was very fortunate to get one of 12 places out of about 250 applicants, and spent a fantastic year in Edinburgh learning nothing about journalism, but playing a lot of table football, and then got a job in the Paisley Daily Express. And that was my route into journalism. As I say, an accidental journalist. And I was there for 8 years. And I enjoyed it, and I learned so much from journalism. I learned how to write quickly, how to work to a deadline, economy of words, how to research, all these things that would later become, very useful tools to the future novelist. But as I say, it wasn't the career path I'd seen for myself. And so there was that transition then from journalism into television.
When someone tells you you can't do something, and in the case of your careers officer laughs at the mere suggestion of it, does that make you more determined to succeed at it?
Yes. my uncle, when I was about, I don't know what age I was, I must have been about 18. He laid into me one Christmas day about what a waster I was and what a disappointment I was to my parents, and I should give up this fantasy of wanting to be a writer, and it all came out of the blue, and I was quite taken aback by it at the time. I think it was prompted by the fact that the previous year I'd run away from home with the band that I played with, and we'd gone off to London and had a kind of crazy adventure. But in a way that kind of, made me kind of put my back up and said, well, I'm going to show you, pal. And I did. So yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, when people say you can't do something, yes, it makes you all the more determined to do it.
One thing I wanted to ask you about all of this research and reading Nightgate, there must be boxes of it. What do you do with it all when you finish the book?
It's in the cellar. and there literally are boxes and boxes and boxes of it. I have files. I mean, particularly my years of doing the China thriller series, I had, the research that went into that was extraordinary. And I have these file boxes in bigger boxes and rows of them down in the cellar, and all the photographs that I took on my research photography, because I mounted all my photographs on huge sheets of colored paper. Some of the photographs, this is early technology, isn't it? I mean, it was pre-digital photography, it was pre-video cameras, or at least not that I could have afforded. So I was taking 5 shots and stitching them all together to give me a panorama and pasting these up so that I had all these sheets that I could refer to as writing a scene in a certain street in Beijing, for example. I would get that up and I would pin it up on the wall in front of me, and it would bring it all back. And later, of course, that changed because everything started to becoming digital, and I got a video camera. So from about the 4th book in the China series on, all my pictorial research was on video, and I started experimenting with editing software so that I could just call up locations onto the screen that I was writing on and look at locations, and it helped to have sound. And I started doing interviews and recording interviews as well. So, all that kind of stuff, it accumulates. Yeah.
There's probably less paperwork generated in solving an actual crime than there is researching crimes for your books. A quick question, talking about your China thrillers. Elizabeth has just sent in a question saying, are you going to write any more of them?
No, I'm afraid not. That was an accidental series. The first book in the China thrillers, The Firemaker, was only ever supposed to be a standalone. And, when I didn't have a publisher at that time, and I just got myself an agent, and the agent was punting the manuscript around various publishers. And one publisher expressed an interest and asked to see me, and I went along. And the editor said to me, I like this, and we'd like to offer you a 2-book contract on the basis that the second book will involve the same characters and the same location, which meant that, what had been a standalone book was creeping into a second. And, when I finished that, and I actually presented them with another idea, they said, no, we want more China. And that went on through the entire series. Every year I said, yeah, I've got this great idea. I want to do the series about a Scottish forensics expert who lives in France called Enzo MacLeod. No. Give us more China. I want to write this book set in the Isle of Lewis. No. Give us more China. And I'd written 6 of them. And I had this brilliant idea for the 7th, and I had a contact who was getting me exclusive access to a very remote and difficult part of China, and in fact, Tibet. I was really looking forward to this trip and developing this storyline, and I took the synopsis to the publisher, and for the first time in 6 years, they said, "We don't want any more China," and that was the end of the China series, and that was it. They killed it, not me, and it kind of. I suppose it was left unresolved as far as the characters were concerned, but it's what year is this? 21. It's nearly 20 years since I wrote the last of those books, and I couldn't go back to them now.
How important is that sense of place to your work?
It's very important. I think the location in which the major location in which the book is set is always like a character to me. It has it because it has its own personality, its own characteristics. It will have its own weather, and weather will always determine the mood of a story, whether it's a grim, dark, cold winter kind of setting or a bright, hot, sweaty summer setting. These things very much affect the way you tell a story, the way the demeanor of the characters in the narrative, and the place itself. Just they always have a personality, and I think it's very important to capture that. And so that sense of place is very real for the reader. Also, as I said, I tend not to write about anywhere that I haven't been to, and I think that gives the reader a sense of trust in me. That again, I'm writing with a sense of knowledge about the place where the story is taking place.
And I suppose the best example of that is Lewis. I listened to an old Radio Scotland programme this week where they take you back to Lewis, and you describe it as, this place looks like it's been photoshopped by God, which I thought was a great line. What kind of hold does Lewis have over you?
It's I suppose it's my spiritual home now. I was born and brought up in Glasgow, and I didn't go to the Outer Hebrides until I think the first time was 1990, when I was going up to research the feasibility of setting a Gaelic soap opera on the islands, and that was my first visit, and it was in lots of ways it was a kind of culture shock. It was a geographical shock. I mean, Isle of Lewis is so different in many ways from mainland Scotland. No trees for a start, and that wind and those wonderful coastlines, and the sea that dominates everything, and this huge sky. It makes an impression on you. The first time you go, huge impression. But I then spent most of the next 6 years, certainly 5 to 6 months a year, filming on location on the islands in all weathers, and getting to know it intimately, to the point where I kind of, I could have seen it far enough. When you're trying to film single camera, in a hailstorm in the month of June, and you're trying to get the reverse shot, and suddenly the sun's shining, you go, no. It offered up many frustrations to the filmmaker. And I, at the time when I quit Macha and quit the world of television, in fact, and left the island for the last time, there was almost a sense of relief. But I think that was a sense of relief at moving on to the next stage of my life, which was about devoting my time and my energies to trying to make a living writing books. And it was nearly 10 years later that I went back to the islands for the first time. And I had the strangest sensation as I flew into Stornoway on that return trip 10 years on, and all the hair stood up the back of my neck, and it just felt like coming home. And I just loved it. I reveled in it, and there were so many people that I remembered and who remembered me from the time filming Maka. That was it was special, and then of course, I mean, having written the trilogy there and a couple of other books with the island setting, it's just become part of the fabric of my soul in a way.
I do love the fact that a novel about two murders, one in contemporary and one in World War II France, you somehow managed to get back to Lewis in the new book as well. Tell us why you decided to do that.
Well, one of the characters in the books, a young French art student called Georgette Pignal, and she is trapped in London at the point when the Germans invade France, and she's not able to get back. And she is summoned to a meeting with Charles de Gaulle, who's in exile in London and setting up the whole Free French organization. And he charges her with keeping the Mona Lisa out of the hands of the Germans because they have this intelligence that Hitler's after it. And so they're going to drop her into France, but they put her through some basic training first. And I'd heard stories when I was on Lewis about the fact that the Lewis Castle, which overlooks the inner harbour in Stornoway and looks out over the whole town, had been used in that kind of capacity at some point during the war. And I thought, well, here's a great opportunity to go back. And it's a big change from, wartime Paris and contemporary rural France. Let's throw in a bit of the Outer Hebrides. And so that section of the book where she travels to the Isle of Lewis for the first time and spends a week training with the SOE at the castle.
Keep the questions coming in, by the way. You can find the chat window underneath the video screen on the website. One of the questions that has come in here asking about your books being made into a film, but why have there never been any big TV adaptations of these books, do you think?
Largely because I've resisted going down that road. I did at one point sign a contract with the BBC for a dramatisation of The Black House, with the potential to go on and do the whole trilogy. But very quickly I became aware of the direction that they were wanting to take it in, and I didn't like it. And so I told my agent to get me out of it, and so we managed to get out the contract, and I killed it. And I kind of, I mean, it would be nice to see, a really quality adaptation of something like the Lewis trilogy, but there are so many bad adaptations out there. I wouldn't want to see a bad one. I'd rather the books stood in their own right and spoke for themselves, if you like.
I think if I was a director, it would be a nightmare trying to adapt books that were written by a former TV producer.
Well, I think there was something of that because after I signed this contract, and in the pre-contract discussions, they'd said, of course, you can be an executive producer on this, and I thought, fine. I know that doesn't mean a huge amount in terms of hands-on, but when we'd done the contract and we then came around to discussing the executive producer position, they said, no, we don't want you to be executive producer. And I said, why not? And they said, well, we think it'll put off the caliber of writer that we want to do the adaptation. Which, well, you can imagine what my reaction was. There were two words which immediately sprang to mind, and that prompted, to a large extent, my decision to put an end to it.
Let's talk.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. On you go.
Let's move to something else, because I need to get this in. We want to talk about Peter May Clairvoyant and lockdown. It's not the first time you've predicted events in the future, but how weird was the whole experience of having written a pandemic novel and then finding it published last year?
It was very weird. And it came totally out of left field. I simply wasn't expecting it or thinking about it. I wrote that book in 2005, so like 15 years previously. And it had gone through the process of being offered to publishers, and it had been knocked back. It was unrealistic. It was more science fiction than crime genre, etc., etc. And it was all water under the bridge to me. That it had come and it had gone. It had been left somewhere in the dusty mists of history, and I'd moved on. I'd written, I don't know, 10, 12, 14 books since then, and literally forgotten about it. I mean, I guess somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered that I'd done it, and I remembered roughly what the story was, but the detail of it had completely gone. But I wasn't thinking about it at all when the coronavirus arrived and we started going into lockdown. It was frankly not in my mind at all. It wasn't anywhere on the horizon as far as I was concerned. I was just concerned, like everybody else was, about staying safe, about not catching the virus, and the trauma of lockdown and how it was going to affect all our lives. And it was somebody on my Twitter timeline who suggested that I might like to think about writing a book set against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic. And suddenly went, ching, wait a minute, I've done that already. Well, it wasn't coronavirus in the book, it's bird flu, but it it just hadn't occurred to me. But that bell having gone off in my head, I dug the manuscript out and I reread it, which I hadn't done for 15 years. So I was coming to it very fresh, and I had all the detail I'd just completely forgotten, wiped, but was absolutely astonished at how much of it reflected what was happening in our lives right there and then, and was quite shocked by that. And I mentioned just by chance to my editor at the end of an email on another subject that I had this manuscript about a pandemic that was unpublished, and he wanted to see it immediately, and I sent him a PDF, and he read it overnight and came back to me first thing the next morning and said, "This is brilliant. We have to publish it now." And I was quite startled by that.
Were you better prepared for the pandemic than the rest of us? Because you'd effectively done the research into what it would mean.
I mean, yes, in lots of ways, I felt I was. I think I would probably have been better placed in government than some of the government ministers who handled the pandemic at the beginning last year, because they just didn't seem to see or understand what was happening and what was coming. And I absolutely knew what was coming. And it was like watching this slow motion tsunami coming from the Far East. And everybody, in a way, could see it coming, but everybody was in denial about it until it washed up on our shores. And I was screaming at the television nightly about what they should be doing now. Do this now. You have to shut this down. You have to. And they were, having race meetings at Cheltenham, and football matches were going ahead with full-sized crowds, and it just seemed like such madness to me. And of course, I mean, all this stuff about wearing masks and washing your hands and all that stuff. I mean, I'd learned that years ago, and my daughter calls me Howard Hughes. I always carried disinfectant stuff about with me, and go on an airplane and wipe down the food tray in front of me with a disinfectant wipe on the arms of the chair, because I knew that if the person who'd been in that before me had the flu or something else, I was going to pick it up. I was going to get it, because all those viruses were going to be on those surfaces. So yes, I was very much aware of what it all meant.
Lynn Halliday's just asked, was Lockdown the original title for the novel?
No, it wasn't. It only ever had a working title because it had never got to the publication stage. And the working title had been, I think it was called Dying with Angels. Lockdown was the title decided upon for publication.
In the new novel, The Nightgate, instead of sipping coffees, people are slipping on face masks. Coronavirus is just part of life. What do you think will be the literary response to these times that we're living in?
Well, I think it's interesting. I know quite a lot of writers have, who've been writing during this period have avoided writing about it. I think possibly because they're afraid that people are just sick of it, which of course they are. But it seemed to me that if you have a contemporary setting, you have to reflect the world as it is, the world we live in. I think people identify with things, whether they're good or bad, but if this is a common experience, people find a certain degree of comfort in that. And so it seemed to me important that I include those daily things that we now take for granted as a part of a way of life, that I should include these as part of the normal course of events during the narrative.
I want to talk about Scotland. There are a couple of questions coming in, people asking, are you planning to set any more books in Scotland? Will you ever move back here? And in researching your life for this session, I kind of realised there were more profiles written about you in the French press than there were in the Scottish press, and you've won lots of awards and acclaim in France. What's your relationship with Scotland now, would you say?
It's a funny one, that, isn't it? I mean, I still feel very profoundly Scottish and proudly Scottish, and I will always want to go back. Whether I would want to go and live in Scotland again, I don't know. I think it's probably unlikely. I've got used to better weather. The wine is cheaper. And of course, I'm now a French national. I mean, I'm naturalized French. So I remain, fortunately, a member of the European Union. I'm a European citizen, which I would have lost had I continued to live in Scotland, sadly. So I don't know. And the French call me, well, they used to call me the most Scottish of French writers, and they now call me the most French of Scottish writers. Or was it the other way around? It's the other way around. The most, yeah. But it's Franco-Écossais, they call me now.
Let's rattle through some of these questions that are coming in now, Peter. We were talking about your impeccable research earlier. Billy said, have you ever made a big mistake in any of your stories, an anomaly regarding the characters or history?
Not that I know of, although, in saying that, somebody will probably leap out of the woodwork and point out, I mean, I have made little mistakes. I've got minor things wrong here and there, and people are very quick to point them out. And I'm always very keen to get anything that I did get wrong fixed for later editions, but nothing major, not as far as I'm aware. I kind of tend to pride myself in trying to get these things right.
I think that's clear when you look at the books and look at the research that goes into them. Louise Colvin said, do you think in crime writing, the character-driven approach or plot-driven approach is most important to you?
Character-driven. I think you could come up with the cleverest plot in the world, and it could leave readers cold unless they are engaged by the characters. The characters are what bring the story to life. And so first and foremost, you have to devote your time and energy to fully developing and rounding your characters in order to make the narrative live.
A couple of people asking, will we see more books set in Scotland? Is the old country still inspiring for you?
The simple answer is I don't know. I have no idea what I'm going to do next. we're still in the grips of this horrible pandemic. I don't know if we come out of it in the near future. Will I return to my Svalbard idea and take that trip that I had to cancel last year? That, although the setting is Svalbard, the two principal characters are Scottish and reappear from an earlier book. I'll not say what that is, but so I mean, I'd been looking forward to doing that. But as to whether I'll use Scotland as a setting, I just don't know. Maybe if I get the right idea, yes.
Pat's been in touch. She's from Lewis and Aberdeen. She said, when you were in school, what did you think being a writer would be like? You know, when you talk to that careers teacher about you want to be a writer, and is the reality different? And she also wants to say, by the way, she loves the authenticity of those Lewis novels.
Well, it's. I mean, you have no idea when you're a kid what the reality of it's like. I mean, I'd already as a teenager, I had written 2 books by that time. Not that I ever got them published, but it was part of that learning process. And I just knew that I loved being lost in the story, living that life vicariously through the characters that I'm writing about. It just, would take me out of my reality and into my fiction. And I loved that feeling and just knew that I wanted to do that. The reality of course, of trying to make a living as a writer of novels is entirely different. It sounds very glamorous, but, it's very, very hard to make a living at it. And there are a very fortunate few of us who are able to do that. And for a long time, I was not one of them. I mean, I at the time I was writing The Black House and the first of the Enza books and Lockdown, I was really toiling. I mean, financially, I'd gone 2.5 years without earning anything. And my savings dwindling, and we were considering selling the house and downsizing and all sorts of things. So there's nothing very romantic about it.
Is there now, though? Is life very different now? And do you still, when people say to you, what do you do? And you say, I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. Is that a thrill for you still?
I don't know. We used to say, if you were at parties and people would say to you, what is it you do? And you'd say, I'm a writer. They'd say, oh, I'm writing a book, and then spend the next half hour telling you what it is they're writing about. So I got into the habit of saying, when people said, what do you do? I'd say, I'm a plumber. Well, they didn't want to talk to you about toilets and, blocked drains. So that was great. So I kind of shy away from saying, I'm a writer.
Did that school that expelled you all those years ago know what you went on to do? And did they ever invite you back?
They did. I was there, was it last year or the year before? I was invited back and I gave a talk to the students. The headmaster was very keen that I shouldn't mention the fact that I'd been expelled. But the library, the people at the school library set up a literary competition among the pupils and give a prize for, I was to judge what the stories that they wrote, and there was a prize given at the end of it. So yeah, it's ironic, the school that expelled you ends up listing you as one of their famous former pupils.
You are just a couple of weeks away from publication of a brand new novel, and you've had thousands of reviews over the years. Does it still make you a bit anxious waiting to see what critics and readers make of a new book?
You're always anxious, yes. I mean, it doesn't matter how many times you've done it. In fact, probably the more often that you write a book, the more you you believe that this time you're going to get found out. It's a hard thing, always letting go, because then people are going to read it and judgments are going to be made, and those judgments aren't necessarily always favorable, and criticism, even well-meant criticism is kind of hard to take. When it's been writing a book, it's such an immersive process. You're totally absorbed by it for such a long period of time that you have an incredible sense of ownership. It's like having a child, and if people criticize your child, you get very defensive. So it's you're always scared of letting go.
You've had so much acclaim over the years, and there's been lots of awards. The one that intrigued me was the one that was voted for by French prisoners, which seems an extraordinary award. Did that matter more? Was it more rewarding? Because these are people who clearly know crime inside out.
Yeah. Well, it was a very weird thing. There was a festival, a crime writing festival at Cognac, which is a nice place to go because they fill you full of brandy. And they had this literary prize called the Prix Intramuros, which is literally the prize behind the walls. And I was told that I'd been shortlisted for this along with 6 other writers who were all French, and that we were all to turn up at Cognac the day before the start of the festival. I had no idea why. We were told that in order for us to continue to remain on the shortlist, we had to go and visit these prisons in the northwest of France, the penitentiaries. And I was given a car and a driver and taken around umpteen prisons, and I had to go and talk to the prisoners. And they had been, I think it was librarians had created the shortlist of books, and that shortlist had been given to reading groups within the prisons, male and female. And they had all read the books, and then they had made their choices. So it was an interesting experience going around talking to these prisoners. I've now been in many French prisons as a visitor, I hasten to add. But it felt a little bit extra special to win, an award that had been decided by criminals. That had to be some kind of accolade, I guess.
And were you, as always, gathering information when you were there, gathering research, gathering ideas for the next book?
Oh, you always do, yeah. But then, you want to do the specific research, and I'd gone to other prisons later for specific research. But these things feed the imagination, and they give you atmosphere, and they put you in touch with a kind of reality that you might not otherwise ever have any contact with. As a journalist, it's the same thing. You experience facets of life that you would never otherwise experience. And that's what was so great, I think, about being a journalist for eventually becoming a writer of novels.
And to finish with, can you ever see a day when you're not doing this?
Yeah, right now I'm not doing it. Maybe I'll never do it again. I don't know. I've got my little recording studio here. I'm indulging my musical fantasies. I can be an elderly rock star in my own living room. I don't know. Other people get to retire. Why shouldn't writers get to retire? But everybody says, you can't retire. You're a writer. Somehow we are exempt from retirement.
Well, that's what poor Enzo thought as well. And he's been brought back into action for this new book. Peter, thanks so much for talking to us. Thank you also to Leslie Crerar, who was our BSL interpreter. The Nightgate is published on the 18th of March. Waterstones are our official book supplier for Granite Noir, so you can visit their website and pre-order a copy or follow the links. Coming up next on Granite Noir, what a finale. Lee Randall talks to the global sensation, David Baldacci. In the meantime, Peter, thank you so much for joining us this Sunday night and being part of Granite Noir.
My very great pleasure, Brian.
Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday night.